Last week we made a significant transition from the first book of Samuel, 1 Samuel to 2 Samuel. Significant things happen. David, of course, returns from Philistia back to Judah. Shortly thereafter, he is anointed king of his tribe only. So now he's ruling, but only over those who are prepared to recognize him, and that's his hometown, as it were. The rest of Israel, at least for the time, is aligning with the family of Saul, who died on Mount Gilboa, but he has a youngest son, Ishbosheth, who is his only surviving son, and so the kingmaker, Abner, sets Ishpochette up as king over the rest of Israel. David doesn't dispute the point, but after a couple of years it becomes obvious to Abner, the kingmaker, that he made the wrong king, and that Ishbosheth is not going to be as strong as he had hoped or expected. And so he actually voluntarily offers all of these tribes, based on what appears to be their consent, to David. David accepts, but before the thing can be solidified, Abner himself is assassinated, you recall, by Joab. And that throws everything into chaos. All of a sudden, everybody is worried, suspicious. Was David behind this? David disclaims responsibility, but nevertheless, all of these dark suspicions arise, and so what might have been a very neat transition all of a sudden becomes very complicated. Ishbosheth himself is assassinated. We cover that this morning. And so for 5 long years, everything more or less twists in the wind until finally, after 7 full years, David will be anointed king over all of Israel, and we cover that as well this morning. So we're going to be moving through chapters 4 and 5 of 2 Samuel, and it begins at verse 1 of chapter 4, the Word of God. When Saul's son Ishbosheth heard that Abner had died at Hebron, his courage failed, and all Israel was dismayed. Saul's son had 2 captains of raiding bands. The name of one was Banah, the name of the other Rechab. They were sons of Rimmon, a Benjamite from Beroth. For Beroth is considered to belong to Benjamin, Paren. Now the people of Beroth had fled to Gibeonites and are there as resident aliens to this day. You're all thinking, did I really want to know that? Believe it or not, that is significant. And it's a very subtle but important detail that actually plays a role in the ensuing story. And so make a little note of it, and we'll comment on it just after we have a word of prayer. Our Father, we're grateful for this life and for the things we learn through it. We thank you once again that David was a very human person, and we can identify with him at many places. We pray that our consideration of this part of his life would be educational to us, edifying, encouraging, and that all of these would take place through the presence of your Spirit, opening your word to us, and we give you thanks for it in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, well, Saul's son Ishbosheth heard that Abner had died at the hands of Joab. He knew he was in trouble because Abner had already told Ishbosheth that he was worthless. He'd picked a fight with him, and on a pretext flowing from that fight, had gone to David, prepared to offer the kingdom to David, and of course, by the nature of the case, that would mean Ishbosheth forfeited that position. He was already wondering what his state was going to be, and now he learns that Abner has been assassinated. It couldn't get worse. And so he lost courage. He's not sure what he's going to do, and the story picks up from there. He is not only concerned, but all of Israel with him is probably in a state of uncertainty. The news that Abner was killed by Joab was probably interpreted by most folks in Israel as a signal that soon enough David was going to invade. They knew David was a competent warrior. They knew that David probably could succeed with the army he had available to him in Judah to invade the other 11 tribes, and bludgeon them into submission. And I think that's probably what they expected would happen. David had, after all, been with the Philistines for a while. They had every reason to wonder, what's this guy up to? And so they're sitting there on pins and needles wondering, and I think probably the very fact that David did nothing actually escalated their concerns. What's he up to? This kind of suspicious mood was probably flowing all around. Well, to make the story a little more interesting, we have this incident involving these two fellows who served under Ishpochette. We learned their names, Banah, Rechab. We learned that they're the sons of Rimmon, who is called a Beerothite. And the children of Benjamin inhabited Beeroth, that city. But then a parenthetical remark is stuck in. Beeroth was part of Benjamin because the Beerothites fled Gittaim and have been sojourners there until this day. And this is where a lot of readers' eyes glaze over. They wonder, what is this about? And so I want to at least give you a little bit of a heads up without necessarily spending too much time, but it does represent a detail that has some significance later. You recall way back in the book of Joshua, that Joshua was leading the invading force for the promised land, crossed the Jordan. You recall all of that. They conquered Jericho, they conquered Ai. Next on the agenda was a set of towns to the north, and one of those towns was inhabited by some people called Gibeonites. If you remember your Sunday school lessons way back when, you know the story of the Gibeonites, who in a ruse came and tricked Joshua into making a treaty with them, when in fact he should have been getting ready to attack them in obedience to this holy war that he was involved in. They didn't consult with the Lord. They didn't check for guidance. They just made the deal because the Gibeonites tricked them into thinking they'd travel from a long way away. You all remember that story? That's what's going on here. Well, as a result of that, Joshua had to make a deal with the Gibeonites, a treaty, and as a result of that treaty, they were given reserved cities. It's very much like what happened in American history when reservations were created for native tribes, and we have to this day, as you're well aware, reservations. It's exactly the same thing. Israel creates reservations for the Gibeonites, the native people who had cut a deal, and we have to credit them for their smart move there. They protected themselves, but they did so in a little bit of an underhanded way. So the Gibeonites had from that point on survived and had treaty responsibility and rights under Israel's law, and they continued to live there. However, Saul, in a kind of misguided display of zeal, had attacked the Gibeonites and driven them out, violating the treaty. It's an odd thing. Saul lacked zeal when he needed it and had zeal when he should have avoided it, you see. And so at this point, he goes after the Gibeonites. It would be as if the U.S. government all of a sudden attacked all the Indian reservations across the country. We would think there's a horrible breach of that prior obligation, but that's exactly what Saul did. And as a result of these people fled to Philistia. And they fled to a place called Gittaim, which means literally a second Gath. They're living as resident aliens, sojourners, technically, outside the world of Israel. That left this city, Beeroth, which had been a Gibeonite city, uninhabited. And so in a kind of invasion, not really justified, but it's just an open city sitting there, these people who were included, the family of Rimmon, had moved in. They are Benjamites, and they move in and take up residence in that city. and are inhabiting it now, even though it rightfully belonged to these others. Why is that important? Because the Benjamites were the ones who should have been most loyal to Saul, and in a strange kind of irony, almost as if it was payback to Saul for his illegal act, it was these Benjamites living now illegally in a city that Saul himself had vacated, who wind out virtually destroying the last ember of his house. And there's a little strange irony in the whole thing, that that's what happens to Saul, as even after he's dead, as a final effect of his disobedience. You might say these two chapters, however, are a tale of two cities. One of them is Beroth, the other was called Jebus, but you know it better as Jerusalem. It also had a history that went back to the time of Joshua. The difference between Beroth and the Gibeonites and Jebus, Jerusalem, was that these people, the Jebusites, had never made a deal with Joshua or anybody else. And they had somehow been able to successfully preserve their independence because of their highly defensible city, Jerusalem, that had never been successfully attacked or conquered. So you have two cities, two stories. And in a sense, the play of these two stories is part of the point and counterpoint that works its way out in these two chapters. So keep your eye on that as we go along, but that'll give you enough to work with at this moment. Now, we have another little detail, almost like a footnote, that's inserted in the text here, verse 4. Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son who was lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him and fled. And it happened as she made haste to flee that he fell and became lame, probably breaking bones in both feet. That's the best guess. His name was Mephibosheth. Frankly, I wish some of these biblical names were like Fred, you know. But Mephibosheth is what we have to work with here. Ishpochette and Mephibosheth and who knows what else. But here we are, Mephibosheth, the grandson of Saul. This little detail is inserted here simply to remind us, to, in a sense, suggest to us Saul's family is really on the verge of extinction. His sons are dead. Ishbosheth, the last son, is dead. And now we have the grandson, Mephibosheth, and look at him. He's lame in both feet. A sad case. And we just get the feeling now that in the providence of God, the disobedience of Saul, in a sense, being visited on the generations that followed, so much so that the whole family is very much in peril as a result of what has taken place. So we're going to run into Mephibosheth later. If you know the story of David, you know that later David reaches out to him in a wonderfully generous expression of making good on his promises, covenant promises to Jonathan. But we don't get there yet this morning. But this is tucked in just to let us know something of the straits into which now the family of Saul has fallen. All right. Then the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, Rechab and Baanah, set out, and it came about the heat of the day to the house of Ishbosheth, who was lying on his bed at noon. They came there all the way into the house as though to get wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and Baanah, his brother, escaped. For when they came into the house, he was lying on his bed in his bedroom, and they struck him and killed him and beheaded him and took his head, and were all night escaping through the plain. It's a paragraph that's written such that we're supposed to be appalled. Here's a man, we're not necessarily cheerleaders on his behalf, we're supporting David, but nevertheless, hey, he's in his own home, he's on his bed, he's already feeling pretty bad, you know. A bad day got a lot worse when these two guys, who are supposed to be his bodyguards, break into his bedroom, stab him, behead him, and make off. And the way the story is told, repeating that, you know, is such that we're just supposed to go, wow, what is up with this? That these guys would do such a thing. And it really does represent, once again, kind of carrying out now this motif of the worst enemies that Saul has against his house or people that in a sense he has unwittingly created, and these two characters that come and do this thing to his son. Well, they brought the head to Ishbosheth, to David at Hebron, and said to the king, "Here's the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul your enemy, who sought your life, and the Lord has avenged my lord the king this day of Saul and his descendants." Saul had sought David's life, for sure. We have no record indication in the text that Ishbosheth had ever actually sought the life of David. He'd been set up as king by Abner. He was, to the extent he was able to, ruling over the 11 tribes, but we don't have any indication that he was mounting some sort of attack. So the point here is overstated. Maybe Ishbosheth would have done something bad to David if he'd had him in his power, but he didn't. And so he couldn't. And so that's really overstating the point in the first place. But to make matters worse, these two murderers now come before David as if they had been laboring for God's purposes. God has avenged you, King David. God has carried out his act of judgment, and we're the guys by whom he did it, And so all of this, of course, is a little bit over the top, and David doesn't buy any of it. David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite. Notice how it keeps repeating that as if to kind of make sure we don't lose track of the irony of the situation. The sons of Rimmon the Beerothite said to them, "As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all adversity, when someone told me, saying, 'Look, Saul is dead,' thinking to have brought me good news, I arrested him and had him executed in Ziklag, the one who thought I would give him a reward for his news." We looked at that story a couple of weeks ago. It was the Amalekite, you recall, who came with the crown taken from the very head of Saul, dead on the battlefield, thinking David would reward him, making him a big deal minister in his cabinet, thought he'd just set himself up for life with David, and of course David would have none of it. And rather than being rewarded, he was rewarded in a way that he did not at all expect, forfeiting his actions with his life. And David says the same thing to these two fellows. How much more when wicked men have killed a righteous person in his own house on his bed? Therefore shall I not now require his blood at your hand and remove you from the earth. We don't know the personal virtue of Ishbosheth. David calls him a righteous person. We know he was probably fairly weak as a leader, but certainly in terms of the circumstances, he was righteous compared to those who had now come and illegally assassinated him. And David is feeling very much within his rights at this point to exact justice from them, even though the life that they had taken was one who at least externally appeared to be David's own enemy. And so Saul had done great wrongs to David. Ishbosheth really had not. At this point, even though David benefited from the death of Ishbosheth, he's not prepared to claim any benefit based on the fact that it was done in this illegal way. And so David commanded his young men, and they executed them, cut off their hands and feet, and hanged them by the pool in Hebron. And they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner in Hebron. Mutilation of a dead body was actually illegal under the law of Moses. And so what David is doing here is at least slightly questionable, to mutilate a dead body. However, it was very common in the ancient Near East to do such a thing for symbolic purposes, in a sense to highlight the crimes that were committed based on the mutilation of the body of the criminal that committed the crime. And so in this case, the hands were the hands that had assassinated Ishbosheth. The feet were the feet that had brought the head to David. And so in a sense, to make it clear that such illegal action would not be tolerated by David, he makes an example of it by mutilating their bodies in this way. Whether or not Moses would have approved that behavior, I'll leave to your own judgment, but David, in any event, takes that approach. The general consensus is that David looks pretty good in this chapter. One commentator summarized it this way: David's best character shows through here, as he refuses to give allowance to an improper means to a legitimate end. He was not always consistent on this, as in the case of Abner, but here, in contrast, his best character shows. Pragmatism says whatever works is right. True virtue says whatever is truly right will eventually work with respect to the ultimate purpose of God. And at this point, David seems to be operating according to such a rule. Well, now we have two dead people within the first 2 years of David ruling in Judah. We have Ishbosheth is dead, and before him Abner. All of that in the first 2 years, and now 5 more years follow. There's no clear-cut ruler in Israel. Each of the tribes, in a kind of decentralized self-governance, is running their own affairs. All of them are expecting David to attack. I think that's at least impliedly the case. David is a known, successful, effective warrior. This standard protocol in the ancient Near East in a situation like this would be that the fellow who is in the position of power is going to exercise that power to get more real estate. In this case, David has every reason to think that he's the one who should be ruling all of Israel, and those 11 tribes are all expecting any day for the other shoe to drop, for David to come marching in, and nothing happens. This is one of the most remarkable things about the career of David. We really don't have any evidence of a war of aggression. He is really a model of what's classically called just war theory. He fights defensive wars when his people are at risk, but we never have an example of him fighting an offensive war, a war of aggression or conquest. And at this point, we have a good case, a good example. David could have certainly, and some people would say would have been justified in launching this attack, but he doesn't. 5 years pass, and finally the folks in the north begin to figure out maybe this guy's not so bad, And so, verse 1, chapter 5, then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and spoke, saying, okay, we are your bone and your flesh. So 5 years have passed. It seems to be dawning on these folks that David is a better man than the rumors had suggested. And so now they come, and the, of course, idiomatic expression simply amounts to the saying that even though we're 11 different tribes and distinguished along those lines, nevertheless, we share a common ancestry, and we are finally a common family. They also appeal to David's own history in Israel. In time past, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and brought them in. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over Israel. The phrase led them out and brought them in was idiomatic for being a military ruler, someone who was able to defend Israel effectively and keep them safe at home. That's the sense of it. The other expression, you shall shepherd my people Israel, literally is you shall feed. The notion of being a shepherd king, of course, we're very much aware of. In David's case, it's probably the most famous example of the way poetically that he's described. We also think of Jesus, who calls himself the Good Shepherd. When Jesus reinstated Peter after the resurrection, he said to Peter, installing him really as the early leader of the church, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, be a shepherd. It was in Israel a way of expressing the idea of being a shepherd, and it highlights the two sides of David's leadership capacity in Israel. Because he is on the one hand a military leader, but he's also on the other hand a shepherd. One commentator really spent some time exploring this and saying it really does highlight in some ways the two sides of government. There is a responsibility government has to defend, to keep safe from external threats. those who would imperil our life. But government also has a responsibility to create a situation in which people can live non-molested, ordered lives in which they can pursue their own destinies without constantly being afraid of oppression or criminal activity or other forms of a society that's spinning out of control, unraveling before our eyes. The government has that role as well. Wouldn't go so far as to say creating a welfare state, but certainly creating a state in which there's a certain degree of security and personal responsibility and the ability to succeed. And in some ways, the roles that are described by David here, to lead out, to bring in, but also to feed the sheep, kind of highlights those two capacities. So the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. The names, if you're interested, of these elders are provided to you in 1 Chronicles chapter 12. I'm sure that 1 Chronicles was written by a CPA, because all the details are provided. Every name, correct spellings, and a lot of other stuff, Social Security number, all of it's there. And so you want to go and see the details here, fine. And Chronicles parallels the book of 1 Samuel, but gives it a much more kind of accountant's approach, if you will, whereas we get more of the storyteller approach here. So we can refer back and forth between the two, but of course here we get more of the narrative as it unfolds before us. So the elders are representing the 11 tribes of Israel, and they make a covenant. This is critically important. They cut a covenant, is the sense of it. And the force of this is to say that it was a mutual deal in which a fair amount of power was reserved to the tribes. This is what we would call, in the ancient world, checks and balances, division of labor, separation of powers, and here it is in ancient Israel. It is known to have been at least part of the model that was in Madison's mind when he wrote Federalist 10 and became the father of the Constitution, slicing and dicing power in our society such that not everybody holds all the power. Now, sometimes they think they do, but it doesn't work out that way. And we have a divided Congress, and we have, of course, a federal government and state governments and a balance of power. I'm not trying to be political. I'm just pointing out to you that before we ever thought of that, Israel had that idea. And you will look in vain, I tell you, for anything like that in the ancient world. This is an unprecedented and breathtaking advance taking place about 1000 BC, when the only form of government that anybody ever took for granted was absolute monarchy, rex lex, the king rules, what the king says is true because the king does it or says it, end of conversation. And all of a sudden Israel comes along and has a lex rex. Law is the king. The king is as much under the law as anybody else. In fact, the king has extra laws that bind only him. Where do you find something like that? Don't look to Egypt, not the Hittites, friends. It's Israel that has this astonishing, forward-looking, advanced system of civil governance. And here we find at least one little critical expression of it. You'll find it in Moses, of course, but here it now is getting traction and becoming an actual expression of the way in which a government might run. And there it is 1,000 years before Christ. So, this would be, I think you could argue with a straight face, the earliest and certainly best example of what's called consent of the governed. It's a covenant, a contract with David in which he's given certain powers and certain powers are reserved, and that becomes the balance of power that is a guiding light throughout the history of this remarkable nation. So David's anointed in that spirit. It's the third time now he's been anointed, once by Samuel privately, once by the elders of Judah, and now, of course, over all of Israel. Well, this is a good time, as they say, for station identification. The writer comes up for air because this is such a critical juncture. He wants to give us at least a sense of what's going on here, how important, how weighty it is. And so he gives us a little bit of a broader thematic kind of declaration of the significance of this. David was 30 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. In Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all of Israel and Judah. It's been about 10 years, maybe a little more, since he killed Goliath on a battlefield. He rules total 40 years, introducing what amounts to one of the most remarkable chapters, not just of Israel's history, but of any chapter of ancient history that we're aware of. There's a book you might want to read sometime. It's not bad. It's written by a fellow named G. Frederick Owen. It's entitled Abraham to the Middle East. Its primary concern is the current Middle East crisis, which of course is daily in the news. And he's trying to trace why is there this protracted and apparently unresolvable conflict, and he goes way, way back to try to trace the very beginnings of this. And early in chapters of his book, he actually treats David briefly. And I'd like to read from page 5 of that book. It's a much longer book, of course, but it does give us an insight of one historian. It's not really writing with a strong biblical bias here, just giving a historical analysis, but he says this, quote, "Everything favored national prosperity for Israel. There was no great power in Western Asia inclined to prevent her becoming a powerful monarchy. The Hittites had been humbled. The Hittite Empire was a dominant power during the time of the Israelite judges. So prior 3 or 4 centuries, the Hittites had been a major world power. They had been basically undone by the Sea People and other invaders, and so they were only a shadow of their former greatness. Egypt, under the last kings of the 21st dynasty, had lost her prestige and had all but collapsed. The great king of that era was Ramses II. His greatest contest was with the Hittites to the north, Israel in the middle there, kind of staying under the radar during the era of the judges, and these two great powers are fighting each other. After Ramses II, Egypt had gone into an intermediate period, decentralized government, really never regained that kind of powerful presence that it had once enjoyed. The Philistines were driven to a narrow portion of their old dominion. The king of Tyre sought friendly alliance with David. And so David, with a steady hand, set out to force back and defeat Israel's enemies who had constantly crowded, horned, and harassed the Hebrews. Moab and Ammon were conquered. The Edomites, alarmed at the ever-increasing power of Israel, rose against David, but they were defeated by Abishai, the brother of Joab, who penetrated to Petra, became master of the country. He concludes, commercial highways were thrown open, and in came merchandise, culture, and wealth from Phoenicia, Damascus, Assyria, Arabia, Egypt, and more distant lands. To his people, David was king, judge, and general, but to the nations round about, he was the leading power of all the Near Eastern world, the mightiest monarch of the day. You can put that picture together, certainly from the biblical testimony, and you can also make a pretty formidable case for it from what is known from external sources. Because, strangely enough, during this period, especially of David and Solomon, his son, about 80 to 100 years or so, it's almost called in fact, it is sometimes called a dark age. A dark age with respect to all the other civilizations of the day, because they just don't have much to say. We don't have great annals recording great victories and conquests. All of that took place before and later, but during this time it is quite quiet. It reminds you a little bit of the proverb that says, if a man's ways please the Lord, he'll make even his enemies to be at peace with him. And in some ways, you get the feeling that's a little bit of what's going on in this era of Israel's history. Well, the king and his men went to Jerusalem. Of course, Jerusalem has not yet been conquered. It's still been an independent state there in the middle of Israel, against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who spoke to David saying, you're not going to come in here. A blind and lame army could repel you, thinking David can't come in here. So there's the Jebusites. Jerusalem was going to be David's choice as a capital. It's some miles north of Hebron, where he has had his capital. David chose this city, called Jebus by the Jebusites, but in earlier times it had always been called Jerusalem, for several reasons. For one, it was more central, and David wanted a capital that would not be viewed as giving favoritism to any particular tribe, and so he wants to move away from Judah as such and find a more central location. Secondly, however, this city didn't belong to any tribe. It was not within the territory of any tribe. It was on the border of a couple of tribes. But just as our District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., isn't in any state, lest that state be able to boast, we have the capital of the country here. That was a conscious decision, as you're aware. So David made a similar decision. Jerusalem is going to be independent of any particular tribe. He also liked that location because it was easily defended. The Jebusites had proved that for several hundred years. This was a city tough to invade. It had great defensive strength, and David wanted a city that had that virtue as well. He also had to do this quickly because so far the Philistines hadn't quite smelled the coffee, They didn't object when David became the king of Judah. They still viewed David probably as a little bit of an ally. And in any event, being a king of one tribe, so big deal, But now all of a sudden they're a little concerned, or they're going to be concerned pretty fast, because now all of Israel has once again been united under a man who is a known, competent warrior. And so the Philistines are going to be on the warpath soon enough, and David knows it. And so he has to do what he's going to do rapidly in anticipation of that. And at the same time, he wants to solidify his own place as a king here based on controlling that city. And so the Jebusites are there. It hadn't been conquered through time of history. They're so confident, they're so arrogant, really, that they have a taunt that if they had a bunch of people who were blind and lame, they could repel an attack by David. This city is so impregnable that no one could ever get through. Now, the storyteller just can't help but tell us the ending before he's telling us how he got there, so he throws this in right at verse 7. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And so it's a marginal note anticipating what we're going to learn in a few moments. And of course, I don't need to tell you, as one commentator put it, from this victory by David, the city became the most celebrated in the entire history of the world, and the center to this day of international attention. I don't need to remind you of that, do I? That for thousands of years, right up to this morning, Jerusalem is a city that people are thinking about, and virtually every day of the week you're going to hear some mention of it in the evening news. When did that start? David. And so he, in taking this city, conditioned all human history since in ways that are hardly capable of even imagining. In the city of David, there was a central location that was a kind of fortress within the fortress that was called Zion. Zion was actually a Hittite word that had been borrowed and applied, but it's been picked up. We associate it with the Hebrew language, but strictly speaking, it began elsewhere and was applied by the Jebusites. And so David takes the city because it has all of these virtues. Now David said on that day, whoever climbs up by the way of the water shaft and defeats the Jebusites, sarcastically, the lame and the blind who are hated by David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. Therefore they say it became proverbial, although it's not quite clear how it became proverbial, the blind and the lame shall not come into this house. Josephus tells us there was in fact such a water shaft. It was a narrow underground drain. I think it was actually a sewage drain, so it wasn't exactly a pleasant experience to negotiate this thing. It was filled with water for the most part, but it allowed about 4 inches for breathing. It took about 4 hours to get through. So this was a bit of a challenge. And the guy who took up the challenge, we learn elsewhere, was Joab. Joab, the nephew, he was not on David's most popular list. He'd been demoted because he'd killed Abner, and Joab looked like he'd just, cut his career short big time, but he rises to this occasion and takes the bait, and he crawls in and draws first blood, and on behalf of David, therefore, he is able to, in fact, infiltrate the city and bring about a surprise attack that led to the collapse of the city. And that's how Joab reinstated himself and became the supreme commander of the armies of David at that time. The Jebusites had a kind of Maginot Line philosophy. It was the comment by one commentator, the Maginot Line was that presumably impenetrable barrier that France used to guard itself from Germany before the First World War, not banking on the fact that the Germans were resourceful enough to just walk around it, And they went through Belgium and attacked, and thus France had some big problems. And so it was kind of the same thing with these Jebusites. They thought they had more defensive power than they really did. The Jebusites, he continues, were too confident and had not anticipated the strategy of a David. They had taunted that the lame and the blind could repel David. As it turned out, they were lame in wit and blind in imagination as they considered the prospects. And then the warning that he attaches to this I thought was interesting. The church and every other institution must be on its guard against relying on old ways to meet new challenges. Brick and mortar will eventually succumb to Amazon. This was written, by the way, by Chuck Swindoll, a name you may recognize, commenting, of course, on the change in economic circumstances in our own culture, and warning the church that while our message must never change, we preach Christ and Him crucified every day of the week, and that's not going to change, and that's the only message that is at the heart of a credible Christian influence in a culture. But our methods do change. They have to change. Times change. We aren't living in the Middle Ages anymore. We're not in Kansas anymore. I mean, things change, and so the church has to re-engineer herself, never compromising the message, but always willing to flex a little bit with the times in order to get that message out. And the warning here, I thought, was a good one for all of us to bear in mind. So David dwelt in the stronghold and called it the City of David, and built all around from the Millo inward. So the City of David doesn't apply to Jerusalem as a whole, but on this fortress area inside the city. The Millo was a little bit like a moat, literally a filling, and it made that central fortress inside Jerusalem even more defensible than the city itself. David's best warriors lived inside that restricted area. One of those warriors was a guy by the name of Uriah the Hittite. Maybe you've heard of him. And because he lived in proximity to David's own home that was also there, it accounts for why David was able to see, rather up close and personal, Bathsheba, and that's a story we're going to cover on a different occasion. But you at least will understand why it was that David could have that kind of view of things at that time. So David went on and became great, and the Lord God of hosts was with him. It's a summary statement. It's looking to the future. Hiram of Tyre, the father of the later Hiram, who was a friend of Solomon, sent resources, trees, cedar wood, and so on, all of which was, of course, very valuable in that day, an export of Lebanon. So David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel. David hadn't been so sure on occasion, When he was hiding out in the wilderness, harried from pillar to post, not quite sure where his next meal was coming from, he wasn't quite so clear in the vision that things would work out this way. But of course, by this time, he knows that God has been with him, and he probably senses that there's something of a greater purpose involved, though I doubt that even at this point, David quite imagined how great that purpose would be. We're a little doubtful here, but nevertheless, there it is. David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he had come from Hebron. Sons and daughters were born to David. I'm not going to read the names there, but you'll notice that prominent among them, bottom line there, is Solomon. And so this is not commended, neither is it condemned, it's just reported. It is, of course, the source of some difficulty in David's later career. It was in the ancient Near East taken for granted that kings would, in a sense, establish their prestige based on the size of their harem. And so David wants to accommodate, at least in that sense, the impressions of the day. I don't know if he consulted the oracle on this. I rather doubt it. But nevertheless, this was the practice of David and, of course, virtually everyone else in the day. He had a large, impressive family, not a very well-regulated family, and that is, of course, later going to cause him some grief. Well, to finish our story off, we return to the Philistines. David knew they were going to be banging on the door. And as advertised, they get wind of David and his new situation, and so this is what happens. The Philistines heard that they had anointed David king over all of Israel. And all the Philistines went up to search for David. And David heard of it and went down into the stronghold. This is this Milo, this fortress area within Jerusalem. So the Philistines had, since the defeat of Saul, really owned the north part of Israel, going clear up to the Sea of Galilee. All of that was under their dominion. They had had a huge and very successful campaign, resulting in the death of Saul and resulting in their successful realization of their hopes in that connection. Abner had set up Ishbosheth, but he'd put him on the other side of the Jordan, where he was relatively safe. He'd made a claim to all of Israel, but of course couldn't do much about it yet. And so it was just a claim on paper. It didn't really amount to anything of substance. David comes along and everything changes. David's claim to rule all of it meant that the Philistines had to get rid of this guy before David gets a lot of traction. And they knew he was capable of it. There was no delusion at all among the Philistines about what this guy can do, because they'd gotten a bunch of black eyes from him in the past. And so this is like their worst case scenario now, to hear that David has taken over all of Israel. So David goes down into the fortress, into this place where he is secure, and it's from there that he's going to figure out how to respond to an aggressive attack from the Philistines. The Philistines went and deployed themselves at the Valley of Rephaim. This is a fairly fruitful valley. It was just to the north. You can see the red pointer there, and under it, it says Valley of Rephaim, and if you see under that, it says Jerusalem. So the Philistines are not, just kind of biding their time. They go straight for the jugular. They know that David's in Jerusalem, and they go right down to that point, and they're planning to smoke him out, starve him out, get him out of there somehow, and put an end to this nonsense of David being the king of all of Israel. To his credit, of course, David, before he does anything else, inquired of the Lord, the Hebrew oracle we've talked about before. Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, go up, I will doubtless deliver the Philistines into your hand. The oracle has been available to David for a long time. He hasn't always used it. He probably should have used it more, but on this occasion, the evident crisis certainly justifies making that inquiry. So David, in obedience to the direction from the oracle, goes to a place called Baal Perazim. And David defeated them there and said, the Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a breakthrough of water. Therefore he called the name of the place Baal Perazim. This appears to have been a kind of sneak attack in which the Philistines weren't expecting. They thought David was going to stay home and that they'd starve him out. They weren't expecting him somehow to be able to maneuver out behind them and break in against them. So it was kind of almost a Gideon kind of attack, with trumpets and lamps and stuff. He apparently just sent them into a panic. Really, it was a great victory on David's part. The term Baal Perazim, you of course see the word Baal there, and you think of paganism in Canaanite religion, but the word in the Canaanite language simply meant Lord, and so it was sometimes used not in a sense of idolatry, but just as a word that was kind of commonly used to describe something that even the true Lord God would do, and that's the way David uses it here. Interestingly, the Philistines left their images there, and David and his men carried them away. These are the gods that were supposed to protect the Philistines. They leave in such a panic that all of these idols are left behind. That's a sign of a significant defeat on the part of the people who run away in such a panic that they leave behind their most treasured possessions. We're told in 1 Chronicles that David took these and burned them. One commentator said of this, there's pathos in the statement that they left their idols there. They had trusted these and found them wanting. Whenever anything valued ascends to the level of an object of worship, it will inevitably let us down. We will run into the battle expecting that thing to deliver us, and as it turns out, we leave those gods in the battlefield. They could not deliver. Every one of us in this room can tell a story, if you think about it, of some time when we trusted something too much. It may have been a good thing, an impressive thing. It might have been something that looked like it would for all the world succeed in our hopes and expectations, and yet when the day was done and it was all said and done, we realized that we should have put our trust somewhere else. That was the Philistines' experience. You'd think the Philistines would take notes, but instead they return. In fact, they double down on the same plan. They come back once again to the Valley of Rephaim. We might think David would think, well, hey, it worked the first time, let's try the same thing again. But to his credit, David once again inquires of the Lord, the oracle, and this time he's told, you shall not go up. Circle around behind them. Come upon them in the front of the mulberry trees. So again, a little bit of a different strategy. The mulberry or baka trees surrounded the Valley of Rephaim, and then the instruction continues, it shall be when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees, then you shall advance quickly, for then the Lord will go out before you to strike the camp of the Philistines. The word for marching can also suggest a wind, like a distinctive, unexpected wind blowing through the tops of the trees. Apparently it was something that you would know it as soon as you heard it. And then David is told that he should advance quickly, but he's also told that God would be actually out in front of him, leading the way. So David did so, as the Lord commanded him, and he drove back the Philistines from Geba as far as Gazer. If you don't know those landmarks, the bottom line is that the Philistines were, by the time it was over, driven out of those regions that they had taken from Saul. They're returned to their own proper land of Philistia, and this became that moment in which David now can, with a straight face, claim that real estate that he was the king of and was able to take control of it. Interesting comment here, the sound in the mulberry trees was that of God going forth. We should always be looking and listening for the sound of God going forth. The forces marshaled against us are irrelevant. The direction of God's movement is everything. It's true in history. It's true in the life of personal faith. Now there's a principle that stands for the idea of waiting for God to move. And that's something we should all bear in mind, that we don't want to go willy-nilly into a situation without some assurance, some confidence that what we're being called to do, God is going there, in a sense, ahead of us. It's balanced by another idea that is also suggested here, that waiting must be balanced with active faith and confidence. There was an interesting description of George Bernard Shaw's St. Joan, which of course is the story of Joan of Arc, in which the balance between these two was highlighted. I enjoyed this, thought you might appreciate it. So the author says, the intrepid Maid of Orleans, Joan of Arc, upbraids Dunois for his slowness in transporting the big guns across the river to lift the siege of Orleans. Dunois replied, the rafts are ready and the men are embarked, but they must wait for God. Waiting for the sound in the mulberry trees, you know, that idea. Joan counters, what do you mean? God's waiting for them. Dunois bitterly retorted, then let him send us a wind. Referring to that very story, you see. A few moments later, the adverse wind shifts. Dunois, crossing himself, drops to his knees. hands his commander's baton to Joan and cries, "The wind has changed, God has spoken, you command the king's army, I am your soldier." Now, if you catch the point here, there is a time for action, there's a time for waiting, and we need to be very astute about thinking, what are we being called to do at a given moment? David stands for a principle of activism, that's the word that's sometimes used, which stands for this, that we should always be ready to move. We should be investing everything we have into the gifts and abilities that God has given to us so that we are prepared to be God's person in any given situation and, in a sense, in a state of readiness. You don't know what God's going to call you to by the end of the day today, what difficult conversation you may need to have. There's a kind of readiness that we're all preparing for, and we should all be thinking of it and looking for it, you see. That's that first attack by David. Baal Perazim breaks in. But it's balanced by what's sometimes called a principle of quietism, that even our best efforts are unable to accomplish God's purpose without the power of God himself. So Jesus says, "Without me you can do nothing." Paul says, "I can do all things through Christ." And you've got that needs to fill our minds all the time as God's people, that we can do nothing no matter how talented we are, and yet we need to be ready to use every talent we've got in the service of Christ in whatever he calls us to. And so it leads us to what's called by some folks synergism, a principle of synergism, that the kingdom of God is built in the balance of God's power joining our diligence to accomplish things that are exceeding abundantly above all that we can ask or think. David had natural gifts. We've seen that. He was intelligent. He used those gifts, and yet he never labored under the delusion, at least for the most part, that he could do anything in spite of those gifts if God wasn't there with him. We're all in the same boat. We all need to be very responsible with the things God has entrusted to us, yet never be deluded enough to think that those amount to a hill of beans without God's grace going before.